Have you ever wondered why someone who once fought so hard for a connection suddenly became completely silent? Most people assume the answer is simple. They think the love disappeared, the feelings faded, or the person finally stopped caring. But the deepest truths are rarely that obvious. Sometimes silence is not the language of indifference. It is the final language of a heart that has exhausted every other way of asking to be loved. That is the truth your soulmate has only recently begun to discover. For the longest time, they believed you stopped chasing them because you had accepted defeat or found someone else to give your heart to. They convinced themselves that your quietness was proof you no longer valued the connection. It became the explanation that helped them make sense of your absence. But then, an unexpected conversation revealed something that completely changed the way they saw your journey. Someone who had witnessed your quiet struggles explained that you didn't stop chasing because your love had grown weaker. You stopped because every step forward began costing you pieces of yourself that you could no longer afford to lose. Imagine standing in the ocean, swimming toward a distant shore with every ounce of strength you have. At first, every stroke feels full of hope because you believe the shore is getting closer. But after hours of fighting against powerful waves, you realize you are no longer moving forward. Every bit of energy is simply keeping you from drowning. That was your heart inside this connection. You weren't chasing because you enjoyed proving your love. You were chasing because you believed one more effort, one more conversation, one more act of patience might finally bring two hearts into the same place. Yet with every unanswered effort, every one-sided sacrifice, and every moment when your love felt taken for granted, the emotional waves grew stronger. Eventually, you reached the heartbreaking realization that continuing to chase wasn't bringing you closer to love. It was pulling you farther away from your own peace. The painful truth is that people often notice the moment someone stops trying, but they rarely notice the hundreds of moments that slowly convince them they could not keep trying anymore. Now your soulmate is looking back with completely different eyes. They are remembering every message you sent first, every difficult conversation you tried to save, every chance you offered when giving up would have been easier. For the first time, they understand that your silence wasn't created overnight. It was built from countless invisible moments when your heart quietly chose hope while your spirit slowly grew tired. Stay with me, because what they have just discovered doesn't simply explain why you stopped chasing them. It reveals the extraordinary amount of love you carried before choosing peace. And that realization is about to fill their heart with a level of shock and regret they never believed they would one day experience. The greatest surprise waiting for your soulmate was never discovering that you had stopped chasing them. The greatest surprise was discovering why. For so long, they believed your silence was a decision made out of pride, frustration, or emotional distance. They told themselves that if you truly loved them, you would have kept trying forever. They never stopped to ask how many times you had already chosen the relationship before finally choosing yourself. Now, as the truth slowly unfolds, they are beginning to understand that your silence was not created by a lack of love. It was created by the unbearable weight of carrying a connection that had slowly become one-sided. You didn't wake up one morning and suddenly decide to stop reaching out. Your heart reached that place only after countless moments when you gave more than you received, hoped more than you were reassured, and fought harder than anyone ever realized. As the old saying reminds us, even the strongest hands eventually grow tired when they are the only ones holding the weight. That was your reality. You weren't asking your soulmate to be perfect. You were simply hoping that one day they would meet you halfway. Imagine rowing a small boat across a vast lake. At first, you don't mind being the only one holding the oars because you believe the person sitting across from you will eventually help. Every stroke feels meaningful because love fills you with hope. But as the journey continues, you realize they are simply watching while you continue pulling both of you forward, alone. Your arms become weaker, your breathing becomes heavier. The shore still feels impossibly far away, yet you keep rowing because giving up on the journey feels harder than carrying the burden. Eventually, however, there comes a moment when your body can no longer ignore its own exhaustion. Setting the oars down isn't abandoning the journey. It's admitting that one person cannot move a relationship forward forever. That boat was your heart, Every message you sent first, every difficult conversation you tried to begin, every apology you offered just to restore peace, every chance you gave after disappointment became another stroke of those oars. Your soulmate is only now beginning to realize how much unseen effort was required simply to keep the connection moving. Perhaps you've asked yourself why you suddenly stopped reaching out. Why one day the messages became fewer. Why the long explanations disappeared. Why your silence replaced words that once poured so easily from your heart. The answer wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a game designed to make someone miss you. It was something much deeper. You reached the painful realization that love should never require one person to constantly prove they are worth choosing. You understood that if every conversation depended on your effort, if every reunion depended on your forgiveness, and if every moment of closeness depended on your persistence, then you were no longer experiencing mutual love. You were carrying the entire emotional responsibility alone. As another timeless truth says, the heart grows quiet when it becomes tired of asking for what should be given freely. Your silence wasn't punishment. It was the natural response of a soul that had finally reached its emotional limit. Imagine a candle placed in the center of a dark room. Night after night it burns, filling the room with warmth and light. No one notices how quickly the wax is disappearing because they are grateful for the comfort the flame provides. Eventually, the candle grows smaller and smaller until one evening the flame quietly disappears. People are surprised by the darkness, but they forget that the candle had been giving a part of itself every single day. That candle was your heart. Every act of patience, every sacrifice, every moment you chose understanding over resentment slowly consumed your emotional strength. You continued believing that if you loved deeply enough, everything would eventually become balanced. But love cannot survive forever when only one heart is constantly becoming smaller while the other never realizes what is being sacrificed. Now your soulmate finds themselves replaying memories they once overlooked. They remember how often you were the first to reach out after disagreements. They remember how you kept believing in the relationship after moments that would have made many people walk away. They remember the times you waited for reassurance that rarely came, yet still offered kindness in return. Looking back, they no longer see someone desperately chasing attention. They see someone desperately protecting hope. Every effort you made now feels precious because they understand how much courage it required to keep believing when your own heart was slowly becoming exhausted. Regret is beginning to replace certainty because they are realizing they mistook your consistency for something that would always be there. They assumed your patience had no limits because you rarely complained about the weight you were carrying. The hardest truth settling into your soulmate's heart is this: you didn't stop chasing because your love became weaker. You stopped because your love had already given everything it could. There was simply nothing left to sacrifice without losing yourself completely. They now understand that your silence wasn't the end of your feelings. It was the beginning of your healing. It was the moment you finally accepted that genuine love should never require one heart to keep running after another that never learns to walk beside it. And perhaps that realization hurts them more than anything else, because they can finally see that while they believed you had stopped choosing them, you had actually been choosing them for far longer than they ever knew. The only reason you stopped was because your heart had reached the place where choosing them any longer meant abandoning the very soul that had loved them so faithfully from the very beginning. Sometimes the greatest heartbreak doesn't come from realizing someone stopped chasing you. It comes from realizing they stopped only after giving you every chance they possibly could. That is the painful truth your soulmate is now facing. Ever since they learned the real reason behind your silence, something inside them refuses to stay the same. Memories they once viewed with confidence are returning one by one, but this time they no longer carry the same meaning. The unanswered messages, the moments when you seemed quieter than usual, the conversations where you simply nodded instead of explaining your feelings, everything now feels different. They are beginning to understand that your silence was never meant to create distance. It was the final chapter of a heart that had spent far too long trying to close a distance all by itself. As the old saying reminds us, the loudest goodbye is often spoken without words. Looking back, your soulmate finally realizes that your heart had been saying goodbye long before your lips ever did. Not because you wanted to leave, but because you were slowly running out of strength to stay. Imagine watching a beautiful river slowly change its course over many years. From one day to the next, the change is almost impossible to notice. But after enough time has passed, you suddenly realize the water no longer flows where it once did. The river didn't change overnight. Thousands of tiny movements quietly created a completely different path. That is exactly what happened to your heart. You didn't suddenly wake up one morning and decide to stop chasing. Every unanswered effort, every one-sided conversation, every promise that remained unfulfilled became another small shift inside your soul. Your soulmate now understands that your silence wasn't a single decision. It was the result of hundreds of quiet moments when your heart slowly accepted a truth it never wanted to believe. They remember how often you reached out first after disagreements. They remember the way you always tried to bring peace, even when you weren't the one who created the conflict. At the time, they believed that was simply your personality. Now they realize it was love working harder than anyone noticed. As another timeless truth says, love reveals itself through consistency, long before it disappears through silence. Your consistency had always been there. They simply mistook it for something that would never end. Perhaps the memory that troubles your soulmate the most is realizing how often you chose hope instead of pride. There were countless opportunities when you could have walked away, yet you stayed. You sent one more message when your heart wanted to stay quiet. You forgave one more disappointment when your emotions begged you to let go. You believed in one more tomorrow when today had already left you emotionally exhausted. Looking back, your soulmate now understands that those weren't ordinary moments. They were extraordinary acts of love. Every effort you made was another invitation for the relationship to become balanced. Every chance you offered was another opportunity for both of you to begin walking toward each other, instead of waiting for only one person to keep moving. The heartbreaking realization is that they didn't recognize those opportunities while they still existed. They assumed your patience would always remain, never realizing that even the deepest well eventually becomes empty if nothing is ever poured back into it. Imagine a musician standing alone on a stage, playing a beautiful melody while waiting for another musician to join in. At first, performing alone feels hopeful because they believe harmony is only moments away. They continue playing with passion, convinced the second instrument will eventually enter. But as the minutes pass, silence continues from the other side of the stage. Eventually, the musician lowers the instrument, not because they have stopped loving the music, but because music was never meant to be performed by only one person forever. That stage was your relationship. You kept creating opportunities for harmony while quietly waiting for your soulmate to meet you with the same emotional energy. Every conversation you initiated, every misunderstanding you tried to resolve, every effort to reconnect was another note in that melody. Your soulmate is finally realizing how lonely it must have felt to keep playing, while wondering if anyone would ever choose to play beside you. There is another truth now settling deeply into their heart, and it may be the most painful one of all. They are beginning to understand that your silence was never designed to make them miss you. It wasn't a strategy to gain attention or create guilt. It was the quiet acceptance of someone who had finally reached the limit of what love could carry without losing itself. You didn't stop chasing because you believed they weren't worth loving. You stopped because you finally understood that your own heart was worthy of being loved too. That realization changes everything. It transforms your absence from an act of rejection into an act of healing. It transforms your distance from emotional coldness into emotional survival. As another old saying wisely teaches, the soul knows when it is time to stop knocking on doors that no longer open. Without saying a word, your heart reached that moment. It wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with quiet acceptance. Now every memory carries a different emotion. Your soulmate no longer remembers someone who suddenly became distant. They remember someone who patiently waited, consistently tried, and faithfully believed until there was simply nothing left to give without abandoning themselves. Regret has replaced certainty because they finally understand that while they believed you had stopped choosing them, you had actually been choosing them over yourself for far longer than anyone realized. The greatest shock isn't discovering that you stopped chasing. The greatest shock is realizing how long you kept chasing after your own heart had already become exhausted. Now they can finally see that your silence was never proof that your love had ended. It was proof that your love had reached its limit of sacrifice. And only then did you find the courage to choose the peace your soul had quietly been asking for all along. There comes a moment in every sincere heart when love asks a question that can no longer be ignored. The question is not, how much more can I give? It is, how much of myself will I lose if I keep giving without being met halfway? That is the question your soulmate is only now beginning to understand you were silently asking. For so long, they believed your decision to stop chasing came from disappointment with them. They assumed you became tired, impatient, or emotionally detached. But the truth they have recently discovered is far more profound. You did not walk away because you stopped believing in love. You walked away because you finally understood that genuine love should never require you to abandon your own worth. There is a quiet difference between fighting for a relationship and fighting for the right to be valued within that relationship. For a long time, you couldn't see that difference because your heart kept choosing hope over reality. But eventually, wisdom arrived where exhaustion had already been waiting. As the old saying reminds us, the tree that bends through every storm is strong, but even it must protect its roots if it wishes to live. Your roots were your peace, your identity, and your self-respect. Without them, no amount of love could have kept your spirit alive. Imagine carrying a lantern through a dark forest to guide both yourself and someone you deeply care about. At first, you gladly hold the light because you believe the journey is shared. But as the miles pass, you realize you are the only one carrying it. Every step becomes heavier, every arm grows weaker, and the flame begins to flicker because all your energy is spent protecting it from the wind. The person beside you continues walking, never noticing the effort it takes to keep the path illuminated. Eventually, your hands begin to shake. You face a heartbreaking choice. Continue carrying the lantern until both you and the light collapse, or set it down long enough to protect the flame before it disappears forever. That lantern was your heart. Every conversation you initiated, every misunderstanding you tried to heal, every apology you offered to restore peace became another effort to keep love alive. Your soulmate now realizes that stopping wasn't an act of giving up. It was the only way to prevent the last remaining light inside you from being extinguished. As another timeless truth says, love should light your path, not consume the one carrying the flame. You finally reached the moment where preserving your inner light became an act of courage rather than selfishness. Perhaps you've questioned whether choosing yourself meant you failed the connection. Maybe you've replayed countless memories, wondering if one more message, one more chance, or one more act of patience could have changed the ending. Those thoughts visit every loving heart, because genuine people rarely leave without first searching for every possible reason to stay. But your soulmate is finally beginning to understand something that once seemed impossible to see. You didn't stop because you lacked commitment. In fact, your commitment lasted far longer than your emotional strength. The reason you eventually became silent wasn't because your heart grew smaller. It was because your heart had been giving beyond its limits for so long that silence became the only language capable of protecting what remained. They now realize that every time you reached out, every time you forgave, every time you chose hope instead of pride, you were quietly asking one simple question without ever speaking it aloud. Will you choose this connection with me? The painful answer was not found in words. It was found in the loneliness of always being the one who kept trying. Imagine standing in front of a mirror that slowly fades each day. At first, your reflection remains clear enough to recognize yourself. But over time, the glass becomes clouded until your own image begins to disappear. That mirror was your emotional world. The more you focused on earning reassurance, seeking consistency, and carrying the relationship forward alone, the less you recognized the person staring back at you. You became so committed to preserving the connection that you quietly neglected the connection you had with yourself. Your soulmate now understands that the greatest thing you risked losing wasn't the relationship. It was your own identity. They are beginning to see that loving someone should never require forgetting who you are. A healthy relationship doesn't ask one heart to become smaller so another can remain comfortable. It invites both people to grow together, carrying hope, responsibility, and emotional effort side by side. As another old saying wisely teaches, a bird cannot keep offering its wings if it is never allowed to fly. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for partnership. Now your soulmate looks back with a level of humility they never expected to feel. They no longer see someone who stopped chasing because they became tired of love. They see someone who finally understood that self-respect and genuine love are never enemies. In fact, they protect one another. They realize your silence wasn't punishment, revenge, or emotional distance. It was the quiet bravery of someone choosing healing over endless exhaustion. The greatest shock isn't that you walked away from chasing them. The greatest shock is discovering how much strength it took for you to stop doing the one thing your heart desperately wanted to keep doing. Every part of you wanted to believe one more effort would finally change everything. But deep inside, your soul knew that real love cannot be carried forever by only one person. That realization has transformed every memory they have of this connection. They no longer admire you because you loved them endlessly. They admire you because, after loving them with extraordinary patience, you finally found the courage to love yourself enough to stop asking for a place in a heart where you had been trying for far too long to be chosen. As this journey reaches its final chapter, there is one truth your soulmate can no longer hide from, no matter how much time has passed. They finally understand that you didn't stop chasing because your love became weaker. You stopped because your heart finally realized that love should never require someone to constantly prove they deserve to be chosen. For so long, they believed your silence was a sign that your feelings had faded. They convinced themselves that if you truly cared, you would have continued reaching out, continued fixing every misunderstanding, and continued carrying the relationship, no matter how heavy it became. But now that the truth has finally reached them, everything they once believed has fallen apart. They are beginning to see that your silence wasn't created by indifference. It was born from countless moments when your heart quietly whispered, "I cannot keep losing myself just to keep this connection alive." That realization has filled them with a kind of regret that is impossible to ignore because it forces them to confront a painful truth. While they thought you had stopped choosing them, you had actually been choosing them over yourself for far longer than anyone ever knew. As the old saying reminds us, the greatest sacrifices are often the ones nobody notices until they are no longer being made. Your soulmate now understands that your silence was never the absence of love. It was the final sacrifice of someone who had already given almost everything. Imagine a gardener who spends years caring for a beautiful tree. Every morning they water it, protect it from storms, and patiently remove every weed surrounding its roots. They believe that with enough care, the tree will eventually become strong enough to stand on its own. But over time, they discover that the soil beneath the tree has been quietly drying out. No matter how much effort they pour into it, the ground no longer holds the water. One day the gardener finally steps away, not because they stopped loving the tree, but because they understand that love alone cannot restore what refuses to be nourished. That gardener was your heart. Every conversation you initiated, every second chance you offered, every apology you made just to restore peace was another drop of water poured into the relationship. Your soulmate is finally realizing that you didn't leave because you became tired of loving them. You left because you reached the heartbreaking understanding that one person cannot keep nourishing a connection forever, while the other remains unaware of what is quietly being given away. As another timeless truth says, love grows where two hearts choose to tend the same garden. Looking back now, they realize you had been tending that garden almost alone. Perhaps there were nights when you questioned your own decision. Maybe after you stopped chasing, you stared at your phone, hoping they would finally reach out first. Maybe you wondered if your silence would be misunderstood forever. Maybe a part of you hoped they would notice your absence, not because you wanted them to suffer, but because you wanted them to understand how much effort had disappeared with your silence. Those thoughts belong to every heart that leaves with love still inside it. Walking away did not erase your feelings. It simply marked the moment when your healing became more important than your exhaustion. Your soulmate now understands that your quietness wasn't a test. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't pride. It was the peaceful acceptance of someone who had reached the limit of what unconditional effort could carry. As another old saying wisely teaches, when a river changes its course, it is not because it hates the land it once touched. It is because life calls it toward a place where it can continue to flow. Your soul wasn't running away from love. It was moving toward peace. Imagine two birds preparing to fly across a vast ocean together. At first, they rise into the sky side by side, sharing the wind and carrying the journey equally. But as the distance grows, one bird continues flying while the other slowly stops moving its wings. Without hesitation, the first bird begins working harder, believing love will be enough to carry both of them. For a while it succeeds, but eventually its wings grow tired, its strength begins fading, and the sky that once felt full of hope becomes filled with exhaustion. In the end, the bird doesn't stop flying because it no longer believes in the journey. It stops because carrying two souls was never what its wings were created to do. That was your heart. You kept trying to carry hope for both of you. You kept believing enough for both of you. You kept fighting for both of you. Your soulmate now sees the invisible weight you carried, and that realization is humbling because they understand that while they admired your strength, they unknowingly depended on it without asking what it was costing you. They now realize that genuine love is not measured by how long one person keeps chasing. It is measured by whether both hearts are willing to move toward each other. Now every memory has been transformed by the truth they finally understand. They no longer remember someone who simply stopped trying. They remember someone who tried until trying meant forgetting their own worth. They no longer see your silence as rejection. They see it as the quiet courage of a soul that chose healing over endless heartbreak. Whether this realization eventually leads your paths together again or simply becomes the beginning of emotional healing, something priceless has already been restored. Your story has finally been understood through truth instead of assumption. Your soulmate now knows that you never stopped chasing because you stopped loving them. You stopped because love was never meant to ask one heart to do all the running while the other stood still. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this connection was always meant to reveal. Real love does not ask someone to endlessly prove their value. It inspires two people to choose each other freely, consistently, and wholeheartedly. Now that your soulmate has discovered the real reason behind your silence, they will never look at your absence the same way again. Instead of seeing the end of your effort, they now see the extraordinary depth of your love and the incredible strength it took to finally choose the peace your heart had been quietly longing for all along.